28 Japanese tankers stranded and going nowhere. That's what happened in the first 2 weeks after Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz. A Japanese-flagged cargo ship owned by Mitsui O.S.K. Lines was struck by a projectile less than 100 kilometers from the strait. The yen hit a 20-month low. Tokyo started releasing oil stockpiles at a scale it has never done in its history. And somewhere in Beijing, analysts were watching every single thing that happened and writing it down. Japan is the world's third-largest economy, a technological powerhouse, one of the most sophisticated industrial nations on Earth, and it imports over 87% of its total energy supply. Almost all of it comes from fossil fuels. In fiscal 2024, oil alone accounted for 34.8% of Japan's primary energy. And where does that oil come from? In the Middle East. Specifically, the UAE at 43% and Saudi Arabia at nearly 40%, together supplying over 80% of Japan's crude oil needs. Now here's the critical detail. All of that oil has exactly one exit route: the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile wide choke point off the coast of Iran, through which 93% of Japan's oil imports must pass. There is no plan B. There is no alternative route that comes close to replacing that volume. So when Iran shut the strait down on March 2, 2026, Japan didn't face a supply disruption. It faced a near-total cutoff of its primary fuel source. Think about what that means in practice. Japan's entire manufacturing sector, its steel, its chemicals, its electronics, runs on energy sourced almost exclusively through a choke point it has zero military control over. That is not a vulnerability hiding in a spreadsheet. That is a loaded gun pointed at the engine of one of the world's largest economies. The immediate damage was concrete and fast. The yen fell sharply. Foreign investors pulled out of Japanese stocks at the highest rate in 5 months. Shipping costs spiked, and 28 Japanese-owned tankers sat stranded in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. Japan does have a buffer, one of the largest strategic oil reserves in the world, at 470 million barrels, or roughly 254 days of domestic demand. On March 16th, Tokyo activated the largest reserve release in its history, 80 million barrels, to prevent panic buying. The IEA coordinated a global release of 400 million barrels, more than twice the amount released after Russia invaded Ukraine. But here's what reserves actually buy you time. They do not fix the underlying problem. If the Strait of Hormuz stays disrupted for months, those stockpiles run down, and Japan is back to square one. The structural dependency remains completely intact. To understand why Japan is this exposed, we need to go back to 2011. The Fukushima disaster caused Japan to shut down its nuclear program. The long-term consequence was that Japan replaced nuclear power with fossil fuels, and the share of fossil fuels in its energy grid rose from 64.5% in 2010 to 68.8% by 2024. Germany faced the exact same moment and went a different direction, scaling renewables to 58.8% of its energy mix by 2024, up from under 17% in 2010. Japan leaned into oil and gas instead. That was a choice, and 15 years later, the bill has arrived. The cost of energy has already risen before the reserves run dry. Electricity prices are climbing, fuel costs are up. That feeds directly into the production cost of every Japanese export: steel, cars, semiconductors, chemicals. Japan's export competitiveness takes a hit at exactly the moment global trade is already under stress. Japan's 7th Strategic Energy Plan, released in 2025, points toward expanding nuclear power. As of March 2026, 15 reactors are operating with 3 more ready to restart. This crisis has made the political argument for faster restarts much harder to dismiss. But restarts take time, and the crisis is happening now. The deeper problem is this: Japan has known about this vulnerability for decades. Former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo explicitly cited a hypothetical mine blockade of the Strait of Hormuz during Diet deliberations on national security law, describing it as a scenario that could qualify as a survival-threatening situation for Japan. That was years ago. The warning was on the record. The structural dependency was never resolved. Actually, China is watching the Strait of Hormuz crisis with a level of strategic attention that goes far beyond energy economics. Beijing is studying how maritime choke points function as economic weapons, and the Taiwan Strait is the next case study. The Institute for the Study of War and the American Enterprise Institute assessed in mid-March 2026 that China will closely study the tactical and operational lessons from the Iran conflict, just as it studied Ukraine. That is a documented pattern of how Beijing processes geopolitical events it cannot control but can learn from. So, what is China learning? Lesson 1. You don't need to seize a choke point to weaponize it. Iran never destroyed a major oil facility. It simply made the strait too dangerous and too legally ambiguous to transit. War risk insurance premiums exploded, and shipping companies pulled back. The result was a near-total halt in traffic within days. Credible threat plus legal ambiguity plus insurance market pressure closed a strait without a naval battle. Lesson 2. The countries that hurt most are the ones with no alternatives. Japan and South Korea, both U.S. allies, both highly dependent on Hormuz-routed oil, took the heaviest economic damage. South Korea's stock market went into a severe sell-off. The Korean won dropped to levels not seen since the global financial crisis. Japan's yen fell sharply, shipping costs spiked, and stranded tankers piled up in the Gulf. Meanwhile, China barely flinched because Beijing spent years building the kind of redundancy that Japan didn't. China imports from the Middle East, but also from Russia, Central Asia, Africa, and South America. Crucially, as roughly half of China's gas imports arrive via overland pipelines, including the Power of Siberia pipeline from Russia, rather than by sea. When maritime routes are threatened, China can pivot. Japan and South Korea cannot. Virtually all of their natural gas arrives as seaborne LNG, now exposed to drones, missiles, and war risk surcharges. China also entered this crisis with an estimated 1.2 to 1.3 billion barrels in combined strategic and commercial reserves. And in the 2 months before the strikes on Iran began, China imported 15.8% more oil than in the same period the prior year. Beijing was pre-positioning. It saw this coming and buffered accordingly. Lesson 3. Cultivate the right relationships before the crisis hits. Iran allowed Chinese-bound crude to pass through a partially blockaded strait while stopping everyone else. That's the geopolitical return on years of investment in the Iran relationship. China buys roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports. That created a carve-out in the crisis, a de facto exception that no U.S. ally received. The strategic insight Beijing is drawing from all 3 lessons: build reserves, diversify routes, cultivate energy partners, and insulate your own population from the shock. And you can use an economic choke point as a weapon against adversaries while absorbing far less pain yourself. According to CSIS, about 44% of the world's container fleet passed through the Taiwan Strait in 2022. Taiwan produces roughly 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. A disruption there doesn't just raise fuel prices, it halts the production of every piece of advanced technology on Earth. Fighter jets, smartphones, data centers, AI systems, all of them depend on chips that come from one island. China conducted its most extensive military drills around Taiwan ever in late December 2025, explicitly simulating a total blockade. PLA air incursions around Taiwan rose from 380 incidents in 2020 to 5,709 in 2025. China's 2026 defense budget was raised to $278 billion, a 7% increase, even as GDP growth slows. The Hormuz crisis is assessed by many security researchers to be making China less likely to pursue a direct military invasion of Taiwan, and more likely to pursue a blockade strategy instead. That what Beijing observed in Iran is that an outright military confrontation triggers maximum international response. But a blockade, operating through legal ambiguity, working through insurance markets, and shipping company decisions rather than direct military force, is harder to respond to. It's harder to build a coalition against. And it inflicts enormous economic damage without the dramatic visual of an amphibious landing that would galvanize Western public opinion. For Japan, a Taiwan Strait blockade would be catastrophic on multiple dimensions at once. Japan depends on Taiwanese semiconductors for its own industrial production. It is geographically one of the closest major economies to Taiwan, and as this crisis has demonstrated, it has almost no margin for energy supply disruption. A Taiwan crisis hits Japan from three directions simultaneously: energy, technology supply chains, and direct regional security. Japan has begun responding. In Tokyo has proposed a $10 billion cross-strait maritime security fund to support U.S. Navy logistics and convoy operations in a Taiwan contingency. Japanese diplomats are coordinating with the EU, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia on potential sanctions packages targeting Chinese shipping. And the Hormuz crisis has accelerated internal arguments for faster nuclear restarts, framed explicitly as reducing the leverage that any future strait blockade could have over Japan. But proposals and contingency planning exist on a much slower timeline than military action. That gap is exactly what Beijing is assessing. Let's bring this back to the core question: what did the Iran war expose? On the surface, it exposed Japan's energy dependency. That's the obvious answer. But the deeper exposure is strategic. It showed the world, and specifically Beijing, that a U.S. ally with the world's third largest economy can be brought to its knees economically by a country Iran's size, using nothing more than the credible threat of blocking a 21-mile wide waterway. No nuclear weapons required, no invasion, no prolonged conventional war. The IEA's head called this the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. The Philippines became the first country in the world to declare a national energy emergency. 3,000 ships piled up in the Persian Gulf. And through all of it, China stayed calm, because China prepared. It built redundancy while Japan stayed dependent. It cultivated the right relationships before the crisis hit. It stockpiled before the conflict began, not during it. The real lesson of the Iran war is about what happens when a major economy has no alternatives, and a rival power is watching closely enough to build a playbook from it. Japan now has a narrow window to close the gaps this crisis made undeniable: faster nuclear restarts, genuine energy diversification, and deeper integration into allied security frameworks around the Taiwan Strait. Whether Tokyo moves with the urgency this moment demands, or returns to business as usual once the headlines fade, will determine how exposed Japan remains the next time a strait closes. And if history is any guide, there will be a next time.